Welcome to Bringing Romans to Life. I'm Preston Burrows, and in this lesson, we'll consider what assumptions we might bring to our reading of Romans and how we might approach this interpretive work. Before we dig into the study of Romans, I'd like us to consider what assumptions we bring to this book. What do you think this letter is about? What messages did Paul want to get across? Why did he write this letter in the first place? Along with these letter-specific questions, I wonder how you describe the Apostle Paul himself. Who was he? What was he all about? And what did he teach others about Jesus Christ? I encourage you to pause this video, open the worksheet for this module, save it to your hard drive, and then open it up and write out your reflections before we continue. By doing this, it will enable you to track your developing sense of appreciation for this letter's complexity, but also to identify the ways you have held insufficient or perhaps misguided assumptions about Romans and the Apostle Paul. So take a few minutes to pause this lesson and reflect on your impressions of Romans and Paul. I'd love to read your answers to these questions, so I encourage you to copy and paste your responses into the discussion prompts provided. We each come to the study of Romans with different amounts of exposure to the letter and the man who composed it. And we carry assumptions about the material we'll be covering in this course. So, for example, when Paul talks about Jews and Judaism, we'll be inclined to interpret what he says in accordance with our preconceived ideas about Jews and Judaism. When we encounter weighty terms like justification, sin, law, spirit, glory, we'll reflexively interpret these words in line with our own assumptions. Or we might simply pass over them without slowing down to consider what Paul might have been trying to get at by using these terms, and how even the first readers might have understood and heard them. We might not carefully consider, at least as much as we can, what these words meant and mean in their context. So I encourage you to approach the study of Romans as if you're on a journey to a foreign new land. Be curious, alert, attentive, and teachable. Give yourself time and space as well to experience this beautiful and honestly, sometimes rather foreign letter. Allow yourself to experience it in all of its complexity and depth. And of course, be patient with yourself. Be patient with me and others in this learning community as we delve into topics that may unsettle you, me, or others. And I encourage you to have endurance for those times when perhaps I present material that seems too academic or abstract or pointless, but because you may ultimately find that those discussions prove actually quite practical and important in the context of Paul's letter. If you happen to have a complicated relationship with Romans and its legacy, and perhaps with Paul and his legacy, I encourage you to give this letter and Paul another chance. You may come to this course with antagonistic feelings about Paul, perhaps because of his statements about women, sexuality, slavery, or other matters. If you don't have such difficulties with Paul, others in our learning community do. So let's engage with one another, with Paul and the letter of Romans, with a large measure of empathy, kindness, patience, and compassion. But I also invite you to consider the letter and what Paul seems to say in it with critical awareness and discernment. And I ask that you recognize that Paul's words and many other passages in the Bible have been used as weapons to wound, oppress, and control people. So let's show a large measure of empathy, kindness, patience, and compassion to our colleagues in this course, especially through the discussion forum. Let me tell you a little bit about my own engagement with Romans. Before I ever had the opportunity to study Romans with any depth or with scholarly helps, I tended to view Romans as this free-floating piece of scripture. And by this I mean I assumed it was a message that kind of developed out of thin air, or more precisely, it developed from God's spiritual realm and it plopped down before me in the Bible in black and white print. I didn't stop to think that Paul had specific reasons for writing this long, and actually his longest, letter to the Roman Christians. And I didn't even really think about there being Christians in Rome. I didn't even recognize it as a letter. And I certainly didn't think about the people who first received the letter and what might have been happening in their lives, in their Christian congregations, and in their city of Rome. But what I've discovered and continue to discover in my reading of Romans is that what was happening during Paul's life brings this letter to life in new and powerful ways. When we understand a little bit more about Paul's context, about the first recipients of this letter and what was happening in their lives, this letter comes to life. In a sense, I now view Romans and each of the books of the Bible as a story of God with God's people, of God's people trying to understand what God is doing in the world. It's our task and privilege to reveal and tell that story as best as we can identify it. To help in this endeavor, I'd like you to begin thinking of two very different people who might have been among the first recipients of this letter. As we proceed with the following few videos, pay attention to the history and religious dynamics that I'll share with you that likely surrounded and infused this letter. Start to imagine your characters, your two recipients of this letter. And as an initial starting point, I would suggest that you choose one person to be a Jewish follower of Jesus, and your second person to be a Gentile follower of Jesus. And as we go along, you'll be able to get more and more specific about your two characters, who they are, what they do, what they believe, and how they relate to God and God's people. Throughout this course, I'll share insights with you that will help you imagine what Paul and the first recipients of Romans likely thought. And through the process, I expect you'll find the book taking on the complexity and rich meaning I too have come to appreciate in this book. As you do, I hope you'll be able to see the ways in which its message confronts, challenges, and even comforts us and the people